Well, welcome everybody. It's great to see you all here. We've missed you over the summer. I hope everybody had a good break. I'm Deborah Smith. I'm Executive Director of Jones Memorial Library. And this is our first lecture in the 2025-26 John D. Owen Jr. History Lecture Series. And you know that we're coming up on a revolutionary year. So 2026 is, I think it's a sesquicentennial, did I say that right? The 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. And so in keeping with that anniversary, our lectures this year are designed to touch on history in Virginia, Lynchburg, from 1776 forward. So we're tracing that 1776 is sort of the initial commitment to freedom in America, and we're moving forward because we know not everybody in 1776 was free. So we're tracing the arc of freedom as an ever aspirational goal for America, Virginians, and Lynchburgers. So you will see, if you pick up our lecture rack card at the back of the room and also on the table in the lobby, you can also find this online on our website, and it will be in our annual report, which goes out at the end of this month. You will see that the lectures are designed to sort of move forward in time. So we'll be talking about women's rights in the spring. We'll be talking a little bit more about religious rights, Quakers and so forth. And also our next lecture in October will be about John Brown and the Harper's Ferry raid. So I hope you can join us for that. So lectures are on select Wednesdays, and they are at 5 p.m. They're about an hour long. I just want to emphasize that we are a specialized genealogy and history archive, and our lecture series is funded through a generous endowment left to us by Mary Frances Watt Jones back in 1920, and also through grants and donations from individuals and organizations. And I want to thank you all for your support of the library. We will be sending out our annual report later this month, so that's an opportunity to look at all the ways that we stewarded your funds and your donations over the past year. So hopefully you will continue your investment in programs like this one. So without further ado, it's now my honor and pleasure to introduce our speakers. This evening's lecture on colonial churches and their role in Virginia is a joint project of the Freemans that they first researched in the mid-1970s for the National Bicentennial. Marge Freeman is the photographer and historian. Joe Freeman is the interpreter of the role of the colonial churches in training the Founding Fathers. Both Freemans have undergraduate degrees in history. Marge also has a master's in library science, so we love that. She is a retired academic librarian from the University of Lynchburg and Sweetbriar College, and she is a volunteer and a board member here at Jones Memorial Library. So I was very fortunate to twist Marge's arm a little bit to become a speaker because I know she's done great work on this topic among many others. And Joe has his master's and his PhD from UVA in Government and Foreign Affairs. He's a retired professor from the University of Lynchburg. He also served on the Lynchburg City Council for 16 years, including time as mayor. So thank you for your service. Marge and Joe will speak for about 50 minutes, and then we'll have about 10 minutes for Q&A.
So, from the beginning, Virginia was explicitly a colony that would have its religious life directed by the Church of England. It's in the charters, it's in legislation that was repeated by the General Assembly. And so Puritans in New England might well think, well, that's no religion. And Catholics down in Florida and further south would say, oh, that's nothing. They deny the Pope and everything else. And so anybody writing from either of those perspectives is going to say, well, there was no religion there. But the story is there was. As soon as the crews and passengers got on land, Reverend Hunt of the Church of England led them in a Thanksgiving service. It was there at the beginning. This is step number one. People argue, well, where was the first Thanksgiving? Well, it's going on, and I was up in New England. And if I'm from New England, I'm very insistent on that. And no, guys, it had been going on for close to a generation at that point. And this was the first Thanksgiving service, Christian Thanksgiving service of any kind on the North American continent that anybody knows anything about. And the memorial is there at Jamestown. And it wasn't just the beginning. No less an individual than John Smith. There's a religious guy, right? Who ever thought of John Smith as religious? This tough old rascal from the Turkish and Dutch wars in Europe describes in his memoir how they built a chapel using a sail from one of the ships as an awning. And so they immediately had a place of worship. That was soon replaced by this restoration of the original Church of Jamestown. Of course, we all know that those early years in Jamestown were really terrible to live through. The majority of the colonists died. But the Church of England had been established there in the general sense, and it was also the established church. What does that mean? It means that if you were a colonist, you were required to go to church every Sunday. That was law passed by the House of Burgesses. And they kept repassing that law, so I'm thinking they kept passing it in hopes that people would pay more attention to it. But at any rate, you did know that you were obliged, at least, to go to church on Sunday. The church was Church of England. The worship service was directed by the Book of Common Prayer, not individual, not I'm sitting here waiting for the lightning bolt. It's we are going to sit together or stand together with friends and neighbors and repeat these prayers every week. And then hopefully we've got a preacher who is well trained. A lot of them tended to come from England and have academic degrees in what they were talking about. So, in addition to that, the parishes were required to put up churches, and we can enjoy them even today. Architectural gems, many of them. If somebody wanted to start, say, a Puritan colony in Tidewater, they would be invited very directly to leave. The church was governed by vestries. And that was groups of lay people in the area who controlled the church. And the colonies supported the salary of the clergyman with tax money. And so that's what an established church meant. It's going to conform to the style of worship in England. You had to go to church. There was one church to go to. It was governed by the local vestry. And what records we have leave me wishing there were a lot more. Because there was a certain amount of tension that goes on. I see a smiling clergyman in back. There's a certain amount of tension between vestry and rector. And that lasted for 150 years with ups and downs. But it meant that there was 150 years worth of people who were schooled in not Puritan, not Catholic, but Anglican doctrine. And I'll sum it up in the words of one of the Restoration clergymen, Lancelot Andrews, that the three legs of the Episcopal school stool, were Scripture. That's a source of authority. Fair enough. We're all on that. Even the Baptists in the room are going along with me at this point. Next, antiquity. Broadly history, more specifically the history of the church, how it developed, its relationship with like the Roman Empire and all of that. So Scripture, antiquity. And the last one was reason. We have think pieces. We need to use them. We can't be excused from not using them. And with that, let's take a look at what the vestries built in their parishes over time. And Marge has done an enormous amount of work, so I expect you to treat this very respectfully.
I'm told I have to push this button if it's red.
Okay. Virginia, as Joe said, was not a Puritan colony nor a Catholic one, but Church of England. And with the required attendance came compulsory taxing to finance the church. But all that changed by the Revolutionary War and independence, when there was disestablishment of the official church. The Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom was the bill in 1786 that caused the removal of the Church of England as an official church for the colony and all financial support of the church by the state. With the loss of funds from the state, the churches had no way to support themselves since pledges and donations were uncommon, and many of the clergy were from England and returned at the end of the Revolutionary War. Since there was no money and few clergy, most of the churches closed and the buildings were left vacant. Many succumbed to the elements and are lost forever. Of the 250 churches standing at the time of the Revolution, only 47 remain today. Even the ones that are standing today even the ones standing today were deserted and had become empty shells without roofs or doors. Many of those still standing were damaged in the War of 1812 and the Civil War. Restoration has been a series of steps of stabilizing the walls, re-roofing, and interior restoration. This one is Southwark Parish Church, which is near Bacon's Castle in Surrey County. Built originally in 1754. When we saw it in 1975, it was overgrown and barely recognizable as a building. Since then, there's been a project to restore the building. Unfortunately, a hurricane blew over a big tree and crushed a bunch of the repaired walls in 2003. But when they complete it, it will probably look very much like this church, which is Christ Church in Middlesex County, which was an empty shell with trees growing where the original aisle was located before it was restored. Hard to believe, but it was. To fully appreciate the work that went into the construction of these buildings, let's look at some information about their construction and decoration. By the way, if you wonder which church we're showing, you can look down in the bottom left and they're pretty much identified as to what church and what the date is for them. This happens to be one of my favorites. The church buildings in Colonial Virginia were not elaborate with spires and stained glass windows, but their simple lines and proportions give them an attractive appearance. They were built by local labor, both free and enslaved, using local materials. The simplicity of their interiors reflects both the English architectural styles and the religious practices of the times. Virginia was a royal colony and observed the practices of the Church of England, including not displaying a cross on the altar. This was considered to be too Catholic. Times have changed, and the interior photos included in this lecture
are of present-day altars, and they do display crosses on them. But that's now, and it wouldn't have been in colonial times. Originally, other denominations were not allowed, only the Church of England. But by the 1760s, other religions, Presbyterians, Baptists, Lutherans, and Quakers, were tolerated, particularly on the western frontier. And some of their churches that are still standing were built by these denominations. And this is one of them up in Augusta. The original church buildings were constructed by local craftsmen using local materials, mainly wood and clay for bricks. And they reflect the skill and ingenuity of the early Virginians. The first churches were constructed of wood, but eventually were replaced by brick structures, and only a few of the wood ones remain. This is one of them. The builders are not always known, but it appears that some undertakers, as they called them, or contractors that drew the plans and oversaw the construction of more than one church. One such architect was James Wren of Virginia with many skills, and he was the first cousin of the famous English architect Sir Christopher Wren, and this is one of the churches that he designed. Sometimes the builders left their initials and dates and special bricks in the walls. The dates were sometimes also carved into the wooden beams of the buildings. We know almost nothing about the actual laborers that built the buildings, both skilled and unskilled, but it's a safe guess that many of them were enslaved individuals. So here are a few of the things to look for in these buildings as we go forward. This one is also a favorite of mine. It kind of looks like a face looking at you, I think. The buildings were usually rectangular, and they were designed so that the length of the building was twice its breadth. And as congregations grew, additional wings were added, making some of the buildings L or T or cruciform shaped. The later churches were larger, and sometimes they initially started out with all of these wings to make them into a cross. An east-west orientation of the building was required by canon law. Often windows were put in the east end to receive the morning light of dawn upon the altar. The attractive brick that was used in these old churches adds a distinctive look to the buildings. The brick was laid in two specific patterns, either Flemish bond or English bond. Flemish, which is shown at the top, was alternate stretchers lengthwise, and headers were the ends, with courses or rows staggered. English bond was a row of stretchers alternating with a row of headers, and that's what you see in most buildings that are currently being built. The headers, the ends of the bricks, may have glazed ends where the end of the bricks were nearer to the center of the kiln and next to the fire, and the superheating of the ends of the bricks melted some of the sand in the clay and gave them a glassy finish. Most of the brick was made in place on the property, so the church and so the Tidewater churches have distinctive dark shiny bricks in their walls, but those of the Piedmont do not, due to a lack of minerals or sand in the clay. The main part of the walls were usually laid in Flemish bond, which is this one shown, resulting in an almost checkerboard pattern. Most of the brick, as I've said, was made in place on the property, and they made thicker bricks for the bottom portion of the walls. This is called the water table and was the similar English bond pattern. It's much wider in order to support the upper walls and to keep moisture out of the building. You can see it sort of sticks out there. To decorate the walls, they used what we call rubbed brick, and that is actually where bricks were sanded by rubbing two bricks together to give them a smooth finish, which gave them also a lighter later look to them, and they were used around doors and windows as sort of a decorative touch to accent them. They also made shaped bricks like this one, which is over a doorway. And, you know, they were adding what attractive features that they could with the simple things that they had available. The interiors are really interesting. One of the things that they all have are tablets on the wall behind the altar bearing the text of the Ten Commandments, the Apostles' Creed, and the Lord's Prayer. A few of these have survived and others have been reconstructed, but their presence is a hallmark of a colonial church. The altar was not the large rectangular piece of furniture that we are accustomed to seeing, but was a table just large enough to hold the communion vessels. You can see the little brown part, that's the altar. The bricks from that were used to close up the openings that had been left by the demolition. And the church was again a rectangle, but instead of running west to east, it now ran north to south. Kind of ingenious doing it. It's most notable for the tablets behind the altar, which are original. And during a recent restoration, they too found that their woodwork had been not the white or brown that you might think, but a light blue. It's really quite pretty. St. John's Church in Richmond, I think everybody probably recognizes that one. It was built in 1741 on land set aside for a church when the city was founded. It is the largest of the remaining wooden churches in Virginia. The interior has some colonial features, but a lot of it has been modified. Unlike most churches that kept church and politics separate, St. John's had a pivotal role in the move toward the Revolution. Being the largest meeting space in the colonial capital of Richmond, it became the site for large political meetings. The Second Virginia Convention met here in March of 1775, and during the meeting, Patrick Henry gave his famous speech of "Give me liberty." The Third Convention met there 4 months later, and at that time the delegates decided to organize troops for the upcoming war. Various restorations were undertaken, but in 1929 it was referred to as a frail-looking and unadorned building. After repairs were made, the church looked to the future and spearheaded an urban renewal project for the neighborhood, with the result that there is an increase in congregational numbers and projects. In addition to regular services, they are open for tours with purchased tickets. A choir up in Stafford County was built in 1751 and was almost completed when it burned to the ground and had to be immediately rebuilt. Finally completed in 1759, it's a very large Georgian building in the shape of a Greek cross. Sandstone was used for the exterior trim. The stone is from a local quarry, which also supplied stone for the U.S. Capitol. Isn't that a lovely door? The interior is the best example of colonial decoration. The building is very light because there are 2 levels of windows. The upper windows are needed to light the galleries around the sides. The old high pews were cut down after Union horses chewed on their top rails when they were stabled in the church. Took a lot of cleaning up, I imagine. The pulpit is a wonderful example of a 3-tiered pulpit with a sounding board featuring a sunburst design. There is an account of the vestry minutes when they debated removing the pulpit because the elderly rector could not manage the steps to the top level in order to preach. But before they took action, the old rector died and the pulpit survived. This is, again, the holy table, as they called it. They didn't call it an altar, but a holy table. It's probably original. It's three-legged with a marble top, just large enough to hold the communion vessels. The tablets may or may not be original, but they certainly have done a good job with them. Pohick Church is in Fairfax County, built just before the Revolution in 1774. The selection of the site was in contention with vestryman George Mason on one side and vestryman George Washington on the other. Washington surveyed the site and presented his plan to the vestry, which accepted it. Supposedly, Mason stalked out of the meeting muttering, "That's what a gentleman gets for engaging in a debate with a damn surveyor." The surveyor being Washington. However, both Washington and Mason worked together on the building committee and chose to follow the plan used at Christ Church in Alexandria. This is a reuse of plans, which happened several times. The church continued services after the Revolution until it became seriously damaged in the War of 1812. The British had targeted the church because of its association with George Washington. For the next 25 years, it was left open to the weather before repairs were made. Pretty pathetic, isn't it? The church continued services after the Revolution, then came the Civil War, and it was occupied by the Michigan 2nd Regiment, who left their graffiti carved into the soft sandstone. Obviously, you can see the love and care that's gone into building and preserving these churches, but what about the people who built them? Now Joe will tell you a bit about the responsibilities of church vestries and how that experience molded their participation in the founding of the United States.
These were part of local government, local government had two elements to it. The county court, which was a court made up of usually leading citizens of the county, or at least people they could get to serve. They met monthly at best, and it was a public meeting where any farmer who came in for court day could come stand in the back and watch the legal decisions being made. The vestries had both secular and religious responsibilities. The religious responsibilities included enforcing moral law. And the device for punishing people did include public shaming, making them stand with a white cloth around them during the church service or something like that. But we don't have much in the way of records to tell us very much about this. Very few diaries were kept that cover local government matters. The church records, I expect somebody took home with them and left them under a bed or on a shelf, and that's where they ended up getting termites and everything else. So extended, detailed information is really hard to come by. So what was the outcome of this 150 years of established church colony, with in particular the Anglican version of Christianity being taught? Now here again, Puritans would say, well, that's no religion because you're not Puritan. Catholics ditto, that's no religion, you're not Catholic, you got no Pope. But if we go through the list of people, men, who were vestrymen, one thing in light of what you've just been looking at, one thing that seems clear to me is they took the job seriously. Now, admittedly, it's going to be the best built churches that survive, especially all the trauma that went on. But George Washington took the time to be there to do things for Pohick Church, and we know that because we know a lot about George Washington. And I think we've got to assume the same thing was going on other places. If they were going to build a church, they were going to build a church. And if we look at some of the men who were vestrymen, I think they carried that attitude, both public service, being available to the community, and that middle ground of Christianity between Puritan on the one side and Catholic on the other. They carried that with them, and also the notion that power doesn't all rest in one place. It varies. Scripture, antiquity, reason, all of them have a role, and we don't need to be getting excited about stuff. We need to be practical. So, George Mason, right? Sort of grandfather of the Bill of Rights and author of the Virginia Bill of Rights, if I'm remembering things. Point at me or shout or something if I make a mistake. Next, Thomas Jefferson. Yeah, he was a member of a vestry for a while. Not much of a religious guy by most measures, but certainly part of the Virginia dynasty and part of the group that grew up in that atmosphere. Patrick Henry. He wasn't just a rhetorician, though that's what people keep repeating. Patrick Henry bore arms and risked death. Didn't just talk about it in St. John's Church. All of these are vestry members who went on carrying whatever they had picked up with them. James Madison. He wasn't a vestryman, but his family was deeply involved in the church and church things. He had an Anglican tutor, and there were clergymen who were in the family. So he grew up in the same atmosphere. And of course, he's famous for writing the Constitution as we know it. Used to know it. And last but not least, the go-to guy. Yeah, and he was spending serious time taking care of parish affairs as the war was starting. And he knew as well as anybody what was going to happen, and I expect he had a premonition or two of what he would be called on to do, and did amazingly well. And so that leaves us, the Old English Church is gone. The American Episcopal Church is about to have a Phoenix-like revival. It's a story in itself. So let's head into the future and see what it brings. Thank you. Question time. I noticed no tomatoes headed my direction, so that's a plus.
This time frame, where did the priest or minister, did he have a home close by? Or?
There would be, usually they had a parsonage, and sometimes they would have a glebe. Everybody's seen glebe road, glebe this, glebe that. That was land owned by the church and available to the rector to farm, whether on his own or with assistance, willing or volunteer or otherwise. So provision was made that the rector would end up having a decent living. As near as we know, and again, we need a lot more records than we got. Okay, right here.
What are the dates of Trinity and St. Stephen's? Are they close?
I have it right here. I knew somebody would ask me that.
Okay.
St. Stephen's was established in 1824, and Trinity in the same year, both by the Reverend Nicholas Hamner Cobbs. And St. Thomas's Sedea was in 1844, Let's see. Ascension Amherst was established in 1840, but the church was 7 years later. Quaker Meeting House was built in 1798. So they're all post-revolution.
Thank you.
Mhm. I guessed the question right. I knew somebody would ask.
Anyone else? Anybody?
Yeah,
been
yes,
on- Yes.
I know that the court buildings had no seats, except for the magistrates and perhaps,
Courthouses.
you know, when you stand trial, if you stood. But the church, like in Jamestown, the very earliest ones, did they have pews or benches?
They
or
had
did they
benches.
stand?
They had benches.
The sermons were long.
Pretty crude benches, but they did have benches.
Yeah, and if you went to church, you expected the sermon to be, if it was like only an hour, you felt cheated. But you got to put mom and kids in the wagon and get everybody straight and get to church and make sure that fist fight doesn't break out in the back and all the rest of those things. So if you're going to sit and listen, you better have, we expect them to have something to say. Anybody served on a church board of some kind? I get perennially fascinated. How'd you like to be on the board of a church that hasn't had a building program for 300 years? Yes, ma'am.
I hate to ask you to repeat something, but the three pillars were spirituality.
Scripture first. Got the Bible.
Okay. Then what was
Next, antiquity. So we know who the church fathers, we know what church history is, we know something about Roman history. And the English church was part of the European Reformation and Counter-Reformation, so recent past was pretty important too. Scripture, antiquity, and reason.
Thank you.
Use this. It's not just an ornament. Some of it's not even an ornament. Yes, sir.
Joe, is there any history behind why some churches put up steeples?
Good question, and I have no answer.
Well, one of the reasons they didn't put up steeples or even bell towers, was that a lot of these were out in the country. So there was nobody close by to hear a bell if you had a bell. So why put up a tower? And that would have been just extra work that, they don't have complex machines to put up these tall things and so forth. So it was pretty much where they could get to, what was easily to construct. But again, the bit about the bells. By the way, they did have what they called chapels of ease, which were smaller subsidiary churches to the big one. And they were usually 6 to 8 miles away from the main church, which was considered a decent horseback ride. Mm-hmm. Yes?
I believe there's a colonial church on the eastern shore in and around Franktown. Do you know anything about it?
Yeah, one of them is Pungateague, and the other is either Manapanai or what's the other M church? Yeah, they're two, and they're in this continuous loop in alphabetical order. I just can't think of them right off the top of my head.
All right, well, thank you, Marge and Joe. Thank you very much. And if you have individual questions, please come on up and speak. I'm sure they'd be happy to talk with you. And just a reminder that our next lecture is in October. It's Who Was John Brown? We'll be joined by Benjamin Greenbaum. Ben is an appraiser for Civil War era artifacts. He's in Richmond, Virginia, so he's making a special trip to us. And Ben appraised the John Brown pike from Harpers Ferry that we have here on display. And this was collected by a family here in Lynchburg from Harpers Ferry, and Ben did authenticate the pike for us. So hopefully you'll be able to come and hear us with Ben Greenbaum next month. But thank you for coming. Bye.
Churches on the Eastern Shore. It's Pungateague and Hungers is the other one.